Most people don't know the quiet decision made. In Ottawa just ended the American century. Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the most consequential shift in North American power did not happen in a war room, did not happen on a trading floor, and was not announced by any press secretary standing at any podium? What if the decision that ended 80 years of American dominance over this continent was made quietly, methodically, and without a single headline in a city that the world has long treated as a polite afterthought? Empires do not fall from the outside in. They collapse from the inside out, slowly, through decisions that feel reasonable at the time, through assumptions that go untested for too long, through the particular arrogance of a power that has never genuinely been challenged by the neighbor it shares a breakfast table with every morning. I've seen this pattern before. Not in my lifetime, but in the records of every civilization that mistook proximity for loyalty and abundance for permanence. For over a century, the relationship between the United States and Canada operated on a logic so simple that Washington rarely bothered to examine it. Canada was vast. Canada was resource-rich. Canada was stable, democratic, and English-speaking. But Canada had nowhere else to go. The geography was a chain. The economy was a leash. And American policymakers understood, in the comfortable way that dominant powers understand these things, that a nation with no alternatives is not really a partner. It is a dependency that has learned to call itself a friend. This understanding shaped everything. It shaped trade negotiations, where American demands were presented as the natural order. It shaped energy policy, where Canadian resources flowed south as raw material and returned north as finished goods at premium prices. It shaped the quiet condescension embedded in the phrase junior partner, a phrase Canadians heard often enough that some of them began to believe it described something permanent rather than something constructed. Constructed things can be deconstructed. That is the first lesson empires forget. The deconstruction began with a miscalculation so ordinary that no one recognized its magnitude at the time. In February of 2025, the Trump administration imposed sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods, lumber, steel, agricultural products, energy. And then came the designation that crossed a line most American officials did not realize existed. Canadian aluminum and steel were classified as threats to American national security under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. To understand what that designation meant to Canadians, one must understand what it means to be told by the country that shares your border, your culture, and your military alliance that your basic industrial output is a security threat. This was not trade policy. This was Washington saying, clearly and legally, that Canada was not a partner to be negotiated with, but a subordinate to be managed. Washington expected the familiar response, a delegation, concessions on dairy markets, quiet capitulation dressed in diplomatic language. The pattern had repeated itself for generations. There was no reason to believe it would not repeat again. Instead, Canada said no, not the government alone, the country. Canadian travel to the United States collapsed by 37% in March alone. Cross-border shopping simply stopped. Polling found that 68% of Canadians plan to avoid American goods and services for at least 18 months. This was not a government program. This was a nation deciding, individually and collectively, that it had been treated with sufficient contempt to warrant a fundamental change in behavior. American border communities felt it immediately. Shopping centers in Bellingham, Washington, saw visits drop by over 60%. Hotels in Montana and North Dakota reported occupancy rates recalling the financial crisis of 2008. The economic impact reached $4 billion in lost revenue within 6 months. But the damage in the visible economy was minor compared to what was happening in the sector. American policy planners had genuinely failed to model energy. Canada supplies 4.3 million barrels of oil per day to the United States. Heavy crude matched specifically to the infrastructure of American refineries in the Midwest and Gulf Coast. Refineries that cannot substitute lighter domestic shale oil without tens of billions in retooling costs. When the administration placed a 15% tariff on Canadian energy, the refineries passed the cost directly to consumers. By summer 2025, drivers in swing states were paying 41 additional cents per gallon solely because of the Canadian energy tariff. Republican governors in Ohio and Michigan broke publicly with the administration. The American Trucking Association described the tariffs as economically suicidal. This is how structural damage operates, invisible until undeniable, and by the time it becomes undeniable, the structures that caused it have already hardened into permanence. While Washington doubled down, something of entirely different character was occurring in Ottawa. Following Justin Trudeau's resignation in early 2025, Canada turned to Mark Carney, a man who had guided Canada through the 2008 financial crisis as governor of the Bank of Canada, then became the first non-British governor of the Bank of England. A man who understands leverage the way engineers understand load-bearing walls, not as a concept, as a physical reality with precise tolerances. Carney's response was not reactive. It was architectural. He announced a $1.2 trillion strategic restructuring of the Canadian economy, $340 billion to east-west trade corridors bypassing American markets entirely, $280 billion to critical minerals processing, and $180 billion to the Arctic Gateway Initiative, centered on a port that most strategic planners in Washington had never considered. Churchill, Manitoba. Churchill is the only deepwater Arctic port in North America directly connected to the continental rail network. A cargo ship traveling from Hamburg to Winnipeg saves 6,400 kilometers by using Churchill rather than traditional routes through American ports. 12 days of transit time, $620,000 in fuel costs per voyage. In an industry where margins are measured in fractions of a cent per ton, this is not an advantage. It is a revolution. The Hudson Bay Railway was transformed from a regional freight curiosity into a strategic national asset. In September of 2025, the first post-Panamax container ship docked at Churchill loaded with Canadian wheat destined for Germany. Canada was formally announcing that North American trade no longer had to flow through American-controlled choke points. Markets responded before governments did. Canadian wheat futures jumped 23%, potash prices spiked 31%. These were not speculative movements. These were buyers making permanent logistical decisions based on a new map of where goods could move and who controlled the routes. The diplomatic architecture Carney constructed extended beyond infrastructure. Comprehensive trade agreements with the European Union integrated Canadian companies into European defense supply chains. Bilateral deals with Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand targeted a 700 million person market. In November of 2025, Carney met with President Xi Jinping in what both governments described as a strategic reset, positioning Canada as a pragmatic middle power willing to trade with all parties, serving as proxy for none. Canadian companies retained access to both sides of the largest economic rivalry in the world. By the end of 2025, Canadian exports to the European Union had increased 34% year over year. Exports to Asia were up 28%. Foreign investment in Canadian infrastructure jumped 340% in the final quarter alone. Global capital was making a mathematical statement. Canada had become the more stable address in North America. The December 2025 hearings of the U.S. Trade Representative became 3 days of corporate testimony functioning as a public accounting of accumulated damage. 147 American business leaders testified. The Automotive Policy Council demonstrated that a single car component crosses the Canada-U.S. border 7 times during production, meaning tariffs applied at each crossing would add $1,400 to the cost of American-made vehicles. Ford cited supply chain disruptions for $1.4 billion in losses. General Motors closed 2 Michigan plants. Lawrence Summers drew the historical parallel the administration could not dismiss. The situation resembled the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, the barrier that triggered a global trade war and deepened the Great Depression into a decade-long catastrophe. The Canadian steel mill that spent 2 years certifying for German automotive companies was not going to abandon that relationship, because Washington changed its position in an election cycle. Relationships built under pressure are more durable than relationships inherited from geography. This is the mechanism American planners failed to account for. Leverage is not determined by the size of an economy. It is determined by alternatives. For 80 years, the United States maintained its position over Canada by ensuring that Canada had none. That monopoly is now broken. There's a pattern that recurs with enough regularity across centuries that it should no longer surprise anyone who has studied it carefully. Rome negotiated with Germanic confederations for generations, while believing it was managing subordinates, not creating successors. Britain maintained the vocabulary of empire for decades after the material foundations had transferred to Washington. The language of dominance outlasts the substance of dominance by precisely long enough to make the transition more damaging than it needed to be. What Carney's government executed in 2025 was not revolution in the dramatic sense. There were no declarations, no formal announcements of strategic independence. What occurred was quieter and more durable. The patient, systematic construction of alternatives, in infrastructure, in trade, in diplomacy, in finance, until the structure of Canadian dependence on American goodwill was replaced by mutual dependence between parties with roughly equivalent options. That equivalence is new. It has not existed before in the modern era of this relationship. And because it emerged from investment rather than confrontation, it is not reversible through the simple withdrawal of the tariffs that provoked it. The port at Churchill does not become strategically irrelevant because American trade representatives decide to be more collegial. The wheat buyers in Germany do not return to routing purchases through American intermediaries because the political weather in Washington changes. This is the nature of structural change. It accumulates quietly in the ledgers of logistics companies and the terms of supply contracts and the career decisions of engineers who choose to build their expertise in Canadian rather than American facilities. And then one day, Someone looks at the map and realizes the geography of dependence has been redrawn while everyone was watching something else. The American century was not ended by a rival military. It was not ended by an economic competitor of comparable scale. It was ended by a neighbor, patient, methodical, and finally unwilling to accept the terms that geography and history had imposed on it for too long. History does not punish intentions. It only records outcomes. And the outcome of this sequence is already determined at the structural level. What remains is for the political systems on the American side of the border to recognize what happened and adjust accordingly. That recognition has not yet fully arrived. When it does, it will feel sudden, despite being entirely predictable to anyone watching the foundations rather than the headlines. The quiet decision made in Ottawa has already ended the American century. Most people do not know it yet. They will.